Elliot Parker stepped out of his weathered Jeep, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots swallowed by the unnatural silence of the veil of the gray veil. The air was heavy, damp with an acrid scent that stung his nostrils, as if the earth itself were rotting. Before him stretched an endless wall of fog, its edges writhing like the tendrils of some sleeping beast. The pale mist clung to the dense canopy of trees, spilling over into the surrounding fields like a ghostly tide. Nothing moved. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the faintest breeze seemed to avoid this forsaken place. Elliot's chest tightened with a mix of awe and dread. The fog seemed alive, shifting as if it were watching him, anticipating his next move. He adjusted the straps of his gear, his fingers trembling slightly. This was supposed to be just another study, a chance to examine an anomaly, something explainable by science. Yet, standing at the edge of this spectral shroud, he felt an undeniable pull, a whisper in the back of his mind that urged him to turn back. But he didn't. He couldn't. Stepping into the fog was like crossing a threshold into another world. The temperature dropped sharply, biting through his jacket, and the light dimmed as if the mist was swallowing the sun itself. His flashlight beam, strong and steady moments ago, now faltered and barely pierced the murk. The forest loomed around him, its trees grotesquely twisted, their bark peeling in strips that resembled torn flesh. Shadows seemed to move just beyond his sight line, darting between the trees, though whenever he turned, he found nothing there. Elliot's heartbeat quickened. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light, or lack thereof. Yet, the fog carried a peculiar sound, faint whispers that seemed to rise and fall, as though the forest was breathing. He paused, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, but the words were unintelligible, like a language long forgotten. A branch snapped to his left, and Elliot spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam fell upon a jagged tree, its roots protruding like skeletal fingers clawing the earth. Perched on one of its gnarled branches was a crow, its eyes milky white, staring directly at him. The bird let out a guttural croak, its call reverberating unnaturally, as if the fog itself were mocking him. Something glinted on the ground beneath the crow. Elliot hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to leave. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled him forward. Kneeling, he brushed away the damp leaves and unearthed an old pocket watch, its silver casing tarnished and cracked. He recognized it instantly. It was his father's, an heirloom that had been lost years ago during one of their camping trips. How had it ended up here, in this cursed place? His hand trembled as he picked it up, the metal icy against his skin. The watch's face was cracked, its hands frozen at 3:13, a time he couldn't recall but felt he should remember. As he stood, the whispers turned into a chorus, echoing from every direction. Words began to form, faint and fragmented. "Come, closer, lost." His breath hitched as the fog seemed to close in tighter, wrapping around him like a predator's jaws. The crow took flight suddenly, its wings beating furiously as it vanished into the mist. In its place, the tree began to groan, its branches creaking as if they were trying to reach for him. The whispers now sounded like voices, multiple tones overlapping in a haunting cacophony. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced unnervingly around him. The trail ahead was barely visible, but he forced his legs to move. As he trudged deeper into the fog, a sense of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation crawling up his spine. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing. Still, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes bore down on him. He stumbled across another object half buried in the dirt, a small leather-bound journal. Opening it, he found faded, scribbled entries. The handwriting was eerily familiar. It was his own. The last entry sent a chill down his spine. "Do not trust what you hear. The fog lies. The fog feeds." Elliot's breathing quickened. This couldn't be his journal. He had never been here before, or had he? The edges of his memory felt frayed, as though something vital was slipping through his grasp. He snapped the journal shut and stuffed it into his bag, refusing to dwell on the implications. Ahead, a faint light glimmered through the haze, flickering like a dying flame. He hesitated, his instincts screaming in protest, but his feet moved of their own accord. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, forming a single chilling word, "Elliot," and then the light vanished. The forest fell deathly silent. Elliot pressed on, his grip tightening on the flashlight as the journal's ominous words echoed in his mind. "The fog lies. The fog feeds." The unnatural silence of the forest seemed heavier now, as though the fog had swallowed even sound itself. His breaths came shallow and quick, the oppressive atmosphere gnawing at his resolve. Every step felt like an intrusion, each crunch of leaves underfoot amplified in the smothering quiet. Then he saw it, a faint silhouette looming in the distance. His heart leapt, torn between relief at finding something tangible and dread at what it might be. As he approached, the silhouette solidified into a towering oak tree, its massive roots twisting like the veins of some ancient creature. Hanging from one of its lowest branches was something small, glinting dully in the muted light. Elliot hesitated, but a sense of familiarity gnawed at him, pulling him closer. When he finally reached the tree, his heart froze. Dangling from the branch was a tarnished silver locket, one he knew all too well. It had belonged to his sister, Eleanor. The memory slammed into him like a cold wave. He could still see her, 9 years old, with braids tied by red ribbons, clutching that very locket in her tiny hands. The last time he'd seen it was the day she disappeared. They had been playing near the edge of this same forest, her laughter echoing through the trees. But then came the fog, rolling in like an uninvited guest. She had wandered too far, her voice fading into the mist as she called out his name. And then silence. No search parties ever found her. But here it was, her locket, impossibly preserved and out of place. The fog curled around the tree's roots like fingers, as if guarding this relic. Elliot's hand trembled as he reached for it. The moment his fingers brushed the metal, a sharp, searing pain shot through his temples, and his vision blurred. Suddenly, he was no longer in the forest. He stood in a dimly lit room, the air thick with mildew and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each crammed with dusty toys and trinkets, all eerily familiar. A rocking horse swayed gently in the corner, though there was no breeze. At the center of the room sat a child's tea set, cups overturned and a cracked porcelain doll slumped against the table. Elliot's stomach churned as recognition dawned. These were Eleanor's things, her belongings, untouched since her disappearance. A faint, lilting melody filled the air, sending a chill down his spine. It was her voice, soft and haunting, singing the same lullaby their mother used to hum. "Sleep, little one, close your eyes. The fog will come and take the skies." Elliot turned frantically, searching for the source, but the room began to distort, the edges melting into shadow. The air grew heavier, pressing against his chest like an unseen hand. Shapes emerged from the darkness, small hands reaching out, their fingers twisted unnaturally, their skin pale and translucent. They clawed at the edges of the room, dragging themselves closer. His flashlight flickered back to life, and he found himself back at the oak tree, gasping for air. His legs wobbled, threatening to collapse beneath him. The locket dangled in his hand, its chain slick with a dark, viscous substance that smelled faintly metallic blood. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. But one voice rose above the cacophony, clear and agonizingly familiar. "Elliot, why did you leave me?" He froze, his breath hitching. The voice was Eleanor's, filled with sorrow and accusation. He turned, scanning the fog, but there was no one there. The pain in his temples intensified, and a flash of memory struck him. A younger version of himself running frantically through the forest, screaming Eleanor's name. He saw her silhouette in the distance, reaching out, but his legs wouldn't move fast enough. The fog thickened, swallowing her whole. Elliot stumbled backward, gripping the locket tightly. His mind raced. The journal's warning, the whispers, the locket. Everything pointed to a connection between the fog and Eleanor. But how? Was she still alive, trapped in some purgatory within this cursed place? Or was it something else, something using her memory to lure him deeper? He didn't have time to dwell. A distant cry pierced the silence, shrill and panicked, like a child in distress. It was unmistakably Eleanor's voice, echoing through the fog. His heart clenched. Every logical part of his brain screamed that it was a trap, a cruel trick of the fog. But his heart, heavy with guilt and desperation, couldn't ignore it. He ran toward the sound, the fog growing thicker with each step, his surroundings dissolving into an endless sea of gray. The cries grew louder, more frantic, leading him to a clearing where the air felt even heavier, almost suffocating. At the center stood a decrepit wooden swing, swaying gently as if recently used. Elliot's flashlight beam fell on the ground beneath it, illuminating something that made his blood run cold. A pair of small footprints, pressed into the damp earth, leading deeper into the forest. The whispers surged, chaotic and overlapping, as the swing creaked rhythmically. Elliot clenched the locket in his fist, his knuckles white. His sister's voice echoed once more, faint and pleading, "Help me, Elliot, please." Against every instinct, he followed the footprints into the fog, unaware of the horrors waiting ahead. Elliot followed the small footprints deeper into the suffocating fog, his heart pounding in his chest like a frantic drumbeat. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself were trying to hold him back. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him in a cacophony of fragmented voices. Some sounded like children crying, others like guttural snarls, but one voice remained painfully clear: Eleanor. It was distant, pleading, and heartbreakingly familiar, pulling him forward against his better judgment. The footprints led to a crumbling stone altar in a clearing, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. The fog circled the altar like a living thing, tendrils coiling and uncoiling as though guarding it. On the ground, between the roots of a massive skeletal tree, lay a dark pool of water, its surface unnaturally still. Above the altar, suspended in the air as if held by invisible strings, hung a figure cloaked in shadow. The figure slowly descended, its shape becoming clearer as it touched the ground. Elliot's stomach churned as he took in its appearance. A humanoid figure with unnervingly elongated limbs, its face obscured by a veil of writhing fog. Its presence was suffocating, pressing down on Elliot's chest like an iron weight. Its voice, when it spoke, was a blend of tones, deep and guttural, high-pitched and childlike, overlapping in an otherworldly harmony. "You have come far, Elliot Parker," the figure said, its voice reverberating in the air like a dissonant melody. "And now you stand on the precipice. She is close, so very close, but nothing here comes without a price." Elliot clenched his fists, his knuckles white around the locket. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. "Where's Eleanor?" The entity tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that made Elliot's skin crawl. The fog around the altar thickened, and the dark pool of water began to ripple, faintly at first, then violently, as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. Suddenly, a figure emerged, a pale, fragile form with tangled hair and hollow eyes. It was Eleanor. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. She looked just as she had the day she disappeared, her small hands clutching at the edge of the pool as though trying to pull herself out. Her eyes met his, filled with fear and sorrow, and her lips moved soundlessly, forming his name, Elliot. He rushed forward, but the entity raised a spindly hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Careful," it warned, its voice dripping with mockery. "She is within your reach, but the choice is yours. The fog does not give freely. To take her, you must leave something behind." The symbols on the altar flared to life, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the clearing. The air grew colder, sharper, as the entity stepped closer to Elliot. "What will you give, Elliot Parker? What will you sacrifice?" Suddenly, images flooded his mind, memories of Eleanor, of their childhood together, of laughter and warmth. But then came other memories, twisted and incomplete, showing him abandoning her in the fog, her cries fading into the distance as he ran. These visions were wrong. They didn't align with what he remembered. Yet they felt so real, so visceral, that they made him question his own reality. "You carry the weight of guilt," the entity hissed, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. "But guilt is not enough. Choose, Elliot. Sacrifice a memory of her, and she will be free, but you will never know her again. Or stay here, join her, and live within the fog forever." Elliot's knees buckled as the gravity of the choice sank in. If he gave up his memories, Eleanor would be safe, but she would become a stranger to him, her face and voice erased from his mind like a dream forgotten upon waking. If he stayed, they would be trapped together, but at least he would remember her. And then there was the unspoken truth, the gnawing suspicion that this might all be a cruel trick, that the entity was using Eleanor's image to manipulate him. Eleanor's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, weak but insistent. "Elliot, don't leave me again." He turned to her, his heart shattering at the sight of her fragile form, so close yet impossibly far. Tears blurred his vision as he looked back at the entity, its featureless face somehow radiating a perverse sense of satisfaction. "Time is slipping away," it taunted, extending a clawed hand toward him. "Decide, or the fog will decide for you." The pool began to churn violently, and Eleanor's grip on the edge faltered. Her body started to sink, her cries turning to choking gasps as the fog coiled around her like a serpent. Elliot screamed, his voice raw with anguish. His mind raced, weighing the impossible options, but deep down he knew there was no right answer, only loss. The entity loomed over him, its laughter blending with the whispers of the fog, as the clearing seemed to close in around him. Finally, he made his choice. Elliot stood paralyzed by his decision, the echoes of the entity's laughter reverberating through the fog. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as though the forest itself were shifting in response to his choice. His flashlight flickered wildly, casting erratic beams that illuminated shapes in the mist, shapes that should not have been there. They seemed human at first, but as the light caught their outlines, it revealed twisted limbs, faces stretched into grotesque expressions, and hollow eyes that seemed to watch him from every direction. The whispers began again, faint at first, like leaves brushing against one another. But they grew louder, insistent, forming words that scratched at the edges of his sanity. "Elliot, you left her, you always leave her." He spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The fog thickened, curling around his legs like hungry fingers, pulling him deeper into its suffocating embrace. Shadows moved just beyond his field of vision, darting between the skeletal trees, their forms flickering and indistinct. The air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of him, and an oppressive weight settled on his chest, as though the forest itself was pressing down on him. Then he heard it, a single voice rising above the whispers, soft and familiar. "Elliot, help me." It was Eleanor. Her voice trembled, filled with fear and desperation, and it cut through him like a blade. He turned toward the sound, his heart pounding, and saw a faint figure in the distance. It was her, standing just beyond the altar, her small frame barely visible through the shifting mist. She reached out a hand, her pale face streaked with tears. "I'm here, Elliot," she said, her voice breaking. "But you have to come quickly, it's coming." Elliot's pulse raced. "Eleanor," he shouted, taking a step toward her. But as he moved, the ground beneath his feet shifted, and he stumbled, nearly falling into the dark pool that had been still moments ago, but now churned violently, as though something massive lurked beneath its surface. A low, guttural growl emanated from the water, resonating deep in his bones. The whispers morphed into a sinister chant, their words overlapping in an incomprehensible language that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The shadows around him coalesced, taking on more defined forms. Figures emerged from the mist, humanoid but wrong. Their faces were distorted, their mouths stretched unnaturally wide as they repeated the chant in hollow, echoing voices. "Elliot! Elliot! Eleanor!" The figures stepped closer, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like images on a faulty screen, but their presence was all too real. The air around them shimmered with an unnatural heat, and Elliot's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched by countless unseen eyes. He turned back to Eleanor, but something about her seemed off. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical, and her expression, though pleading, lacked the warmth he remembered. The way she stood, just beyond his reach, felt deliberate, as if she were a lure rather than a person. "Eleanor," he said cautiously, his voice shaking. "Is it really you?" Her head tilted slightly, and for a moment, she didn't respond. Then she stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound against the forest floor. The whispers around him fell silent, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. "You don't trust me," she said, her voice eerily calm. "After all this time, you still don't trust me." Elliot's throat tightened. Something was wrong. The Eleanor he remembered would have run to him, thrown her arms around him, clung to him like a lifeline. This Eleanor, she stood motionless, her eyes dark and unfathomable, her voice carrying an edge that made his blood run cold. Suddenly, the shadows around him surged forward, closing the distance in an instant. Elliot raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist, but the figures were unaffected. They circled him, their glowing eyes fixed on his every move. One of them reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was icy, and a wave of nausea rolled through him as the whispers resumed, louder and more chaotic than before. "Leave the fog, leave her, leave yourself." Elliot stumbled backward, his breathing ragged. The ground beneath him shifted again, and the altar seemed to pulse with a sickly light, the symbols carved into its surface writhing like living things. The dark pool beside it began to rise, its inky blackness spilling over the edges, creeping toward him like a sentient mass. "Elliot," Eleanor's voice called again, sharper this time. "You have to trust me, or it will take us both." He looked at her, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear. Her form wavered in the mist, flickering like a dying flame. She extended her hand further, her fingers trembling. "Please," she whispered. "Before it's too late." The growl from the pool deepened, and a massive shape began to rise from its depths. Elliot's instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The creature that emerged defied all logic and reason, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs, eyes, and mouths, its form constantly shifting and contorting. It let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the forest like an earthquake, and the shadows around him recoiled as though in fear. Elliot had seconds to act. He turned back to Eleanor, her outstretched hand the only anchor in the chaos. But as he reached for her, he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his mind. Was this truly his sister, or just another trick of the fog? Elliot's hand hovered in midair, inches from Eleanor's trembling fingers. The whispers in the fog grew louder, now an indecipherable storm of voices that clawed at his sanity. Behind her, the monstrous entity that had risen from the dark pool loomed like a nightmare given form. Its body writhed with impossible shapes. Dozens of eyes opened and closed across its surface, while gaping mouths bared jagged teeth that seemed to drip with darkness itself. Its roar shook the forest, but it was the silence that followed that unsettled Elliot the most. It wasn't the absence of sound, it was the absence of life. Eleanor's face flickered in the dim light, her features twisting for the briefest moment into something grotesque and alien before returning to the familiar, tear-streaked visage he remembered. "Elliot," she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "You have to take my hand. It's the only way. Please." He hesitated, his chest tightening as doubt gnawed at him. Could he trust her? Could he trust anything in this place? The fog whispered to him now, directly in his ear, its words venomous and coaxing. "She isn't real," it hissed. "You know she's not real. You've seen the truth. Leave her. Save yourself." Elliot shook his head, trying to dispel the voice, but it slithered deeper into his mind, unearthing thoughts he didn't want to confront. Memories of guilt and fear resurfaced, of the day Eleanor vanished and the days that followed, when he was too paralyzed by terror to keep searching for her. The voice twisted those memories, amplifying his shame. "You let her go once," it sneered. "You'll do it again. It's who you are." Eleanor's voice cut through the fog, trembling but insistent. "Don't listen to it. It's lying to you. I'm real, Elliot. You have to believe me." But even her voice began to twist in his ears. Was it hers, or was it just another trick of the fog? He clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms as the weight of the decision bore down on him. His breathing quickened as the whispers around him morphed into vivid, horrifying visions. The forest shifted, and suddenly Elliot was standing in his childhood home. The air was thick with smoke, and flames licked at the walls, devouring everything in their path. He saw himself as a boy, crouched in a corner, his face streaked with soot and tears. Across the room, Eleanor stood trapped, flames encircling her as she screamed for help. "Help me, Elliot," her voice cried, echoing through the fiery chaos. But he didn't move. The boy in the vision stayed frozen, his face contorted with fear, until the flames consumed her. The vision faded, leaving him back in the fog, gasping for air. "That's not real," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky. "That never happened." But the fog pressed closer, filling his mind with more horrors. He saw Eleanor's face again, but it was gaunt and lifeless, her eyes sunken and her mouth twisted in a silent scream. He saw himself standing over her grave, his hands stained with dirt, as if he had been the one to bury her. The visions became unbearable, each one more grotesque and vivid than the last, feeding on his fear and doubt. "Elliot," the fog whispered again, its voice soft and intimate now, like a lover's breath against his ear. "You can end this. Just let go. Walk away. She's already gone." But Eleanor's voice rose again, cutting through the suffocating despair. "Elliot, please. Don't leave me. You promised you'd never leave me." His mind was a battlefield, torn between the whispers of the fog and the faint hope that his sister was truly there. The shadows around him began to close in, their forms becoming more distinct. He could see faces now, distorted, hollow-eyed specters that reached out for him with claw-like hands. Their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, but their eyes screamed of torment and despair. One of them stepped closer, its face unnervingly familiar. Elliot's stomach dropped as he recognized it. It was him. A twisted, hollow version of himself, its skin gray and cracked, its eyes burning with a cold, unnatural light. The specter tilted its head, a cruel smile spreading across its face. "She's already dead, Elliot," it said, its voice an eerie mirror of his own. "You know she is. Stop lying to yourself." Elliot stumbled backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The light fell on Eleanor again, her hand still outstretched. Her expression was one of pure sorrow, her tears glistening like tiny stars in the fog. "I'm here," she said softly. "You have to trust me. Please, Elliot." Don't let it take me. The fog roared, the shadows surged, and Elliot's mind teetered on the edge of collapse. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape this nightmare. But then he looked at Eleanor again, and for a moment, just a moment, he saw the sister he remembered. The way her hand trembled, the way her voice broke, the way her eyes begged him to believe her. Elliot. Her voice wavered, barely a whisper now. Don't leave me again. His legs felt like lead, his body trembling under the weight of his fear. But he forced himself to take a step forward, then another, until he was standing just inches from her. Her hand was still outstretched, her eyes wide with hope and terror. Elliot reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. The instant they touched, the fog exploded into a deafening roar, the shadows shrieking as they surged toward him. And then, everything went black. Elliot awoke to suffocating darkness, his head pounding and his body frozen with dread. The world around him was silent, too silent, as if sound itself had been devoured by the fog. He tried to move, but his limbs felt as though they were bound by invisible chains, held in place by a force far beyond his understanding. Slowly, his vision adjusted, revealing his surroundings, a cavernous space filled with an unnatural, pulsating light. The walls were alive, slick with a black, viscous substance that oozed and dripped like blood from an open wound. Shadows twisted and danced across the surface, forming fleeting, grotesque shapes that seemed to watch him. In the center of the room stood the altar, now fully transformed. Its surface burned with symbols that writhed and flickered, their glow illuminating a towering figure, the entity. Its form was even more monstrous now, its limbs impossibly long and contorted, its many eyes staring down at Elliot with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Mouths opened and closed across its body, each one whispering, growling, or screaming in a language that felt like it was burrowing into his mind. And there, crumpled at the base of the altar, was Eleanor. Her body was motionless, her face pale and lifeless, as if the very essence of her had been drained. A faint glow emanated from her chest, flickering like the last ember of a dying fire. Elliot's heart clenched at the sight, a wave of guilt and despair crashing over him. "You're too late," the entity hissed, its voice a symphony of overlapping tones, mocking, menacing, and almost gleeful. "She is mine now. She always was." Elliot struggled against the unseen force holding him down, his mind racing. He couldn't lose her again, not like this. The fog had lied to him, twisted his memories and fears, but he refused to let it win. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. The entity tilted its head, its many eyes narrowing. "Let her go," it repeated, as if the idea amused it. "Why would I? She belongs to me, just as you will soon belong to me." The glow in Eleanor's chest began to fade, and Elliot felt something shift inside him, a surge of defiance that burned brighter than his fear. He forced himself to his feet, the invisible chains snapping as he took a step forward. The entity's mouth twisted into grotesque smiles, its form towering over him as the cavern trembled. "You think you can save her," it sneered. "You couldn't save her then. You couldn't even save yourself." The fog around Elliot thickened, swirling with images that clawed at his sanity. He saw himself running from the forest as a child, leaving Eleanor behind. He saw her face, twisted in terror, reaching for him as the fog consumed her. He saw his adult self, staring into the fog and turning away, abandoning her again and again. "You've always been a coward," the entity growled. "And now, you will face the truth." The visions twisted, and Elliot found himself standing in a distorted version of his childhood home. The walls were cracked and bleeding, and the air was filled with the sound of Eleanor's laughter, soft at first, but growing louder, sharper, until it became a piercing scream. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes hollow and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You left me," she said, her voice a haunting echo. "You always leave me." Elliot clenched his fists, his breathing ragged. "No," he whispered, his voice shaking. "That's not true." "I didn't. Didn't you?" the entity interrupted, its voice echoing all around him. "You ran. You let her go. You let your fear decide for you." The images flickered, the house dissolving into the cavern once more. The entity loomed closer, its many mouths curling into sneers. "And now, you will make the same choice. Take her place, and I will let her go. Refuse, and she will be mine forever." Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The glow in Eleanor's chest was nearly gone, her body trembling as if on the brink of being consumed. He looked at her, then back at the entity, his mind racing. Sacrifice himself to save her? Or walk away, knowing he would lose her forever? The cavern trembled, the fog pressing in on him, suffocating and relentless. The entity stepped back, its form twisting as it gestured toward Eleanor. "Decide, Elliot," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "But know this, fear will consume you either way." Elliot closed his eyes, the weight of his guilt and fear threatening to crush him. But beneath it all, he felt a flicker of something else, hope. The fog had lied before. The entity had twisted his memories, preyed on his guilt. If it wanted him to choose, it meant it feared his defiance. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto Eleanor. "You don't control me," he said, his voice steady. "And you don't own her." The entity let out a deafening roar, its many mouths opening wide as the cavern shook violently. The glow in Eleanor's chest flared brighter, and Elliot rushed forward, ignoring the shadows clawing at him and the voices screaming in his ears. He reached her, his hands trembling as he grabbed hers. "Elliot," she whispered weakly, her eyes fluttering open. He pulled her close, shielding her as the fog surged around them, the entity's form writhing and collapsing in on itself. The cavern dissolved into blinding light, and for a moment, everything was silent. When Elliot opened his eyes, he was standing in the forest again. The fog was gone, the air crisp and clear. Eleanor stood beside him, her small hand clutching his. But something lingered in her gaze, a shadow, a faint flicker of the fog that refused to let go. "We have to go," she said softly, her voice trembling. Elliot nodded, but as they turned to leave, a faint whisper carried on the wind. "It's not over, Elliot. It's never over." The forest around Elliot and Eleanor seemed unnaturally still as they walked, the absence of the fog revealing a landscape that felt alien and wrong. The trees were bare and gnarled, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath their feet was soft, almost spongy, and a faint metallic smell lingered in the air. Despite the clearing of the fog, an oppressive heaviness remained, clinging to them like an unseen weight. Eleanor's grip on Elliot's hand was firm, but her skin was ice cold, and her expression was distant, as though part of her mind was still trapped in the nightmare they had just escaped. Elliot kept his flashlight trained ahead, its beam flickering intermittently as if struggling against the darkness. Every few steps, he glanced at Eleanor, searching for signs that she was truly herself. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and her gaze never met his. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth he remembered. "We have to keep moving. It's not safe here." A chill ran down Elliot's spine. The words felt rehearsed, as though they weren't her own. He tried to shake off the unease, but it gnawed at him, growing stronger with each step. The forest stretched endlessly before them, the path twisting and turning as if trying to disorient them. Shadows danced at the edges of his vision, but every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. Then the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, like a distant breeze rustling through leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent, their overlapping voices forming fragmented words. "You left her." The whispers circled them, moving closer with each repetition. Elliot tightened his grip on Eleanor's hand, but she didn't react. Her expression remained blank, her gaze fixed ahead. "Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" She stopped abruptly, her head tilting slightly to the side as if listening. Then, without warning, she turned to face him. Her eyes, once filled with fear and sorrow, were now dark and empty, like twin voids that seemed to pull him in. "It's coming," she said, her voice an eerie monotone. Before Elliot could respond, the ground beneath them trembled, a low rumble reverberating through the forest. The whispers escalated into a deafening roar, and the shadows around them coalesced into a massive, shifting form. It was the entity, no longer bound to the altar or the fog. Its body towered above the treetops, a grotesque amalgamation of eyes, mouths, and twisting limbs that writhed in perpetual motion. The air grew heavy with its presence, the sheer weight of it pressing down on Elliot's chest like a vice. The entity let out a guttural roar, its many mouths speaking in unison. "Did you think you could escape? Did you think I would let her go?" Elliot stepped in front of Eleanor, his heart pounding as he faced the monstrous figure. "You've lost," he said, his voice shaking but defiant. "She's free. You can't have her." The entity's laughter was a chorus of discordant tones, each one more grating than the last. "Free? Look at her, Elliot. Do you think she is truly free?" Elliot turned to Eleanor, and his heart sank. Her body was trembling, her skin pale and translucent. The faint glow in her chest, the same light he had seen before, was flickering erratically, as if being snuffed out. Her hands clutched at her chest, and her eyes, now filled with fear, met his. "It's still inside me," she whispered. "It never left." The entity loomed closer, its many eyes narrowing in satisfaction. "She is mine, Elliot. She always was. But now so are you." The ground split open beneath their feet, revealing an abyss filled with writhing tendrils of darkness. They reached for Eleanor, wrapping around her legs and pulling her toward the edge. She screamed, her voice raw with terror, and Elliot lunged forward, grabbing her arms. The tendrils tightened their grip, dragging her closer to the chasm. Elliot's mind raced as he struggled to pull her back. "Fight it," he shouted. "You're stronger than this." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she shook her head. "I can't," she sobbed. "It's too strong. You have to let me go." "I won't," Elliot shouted, his voice filled with desperation. He tightened his grip, his knuckles white as he fought against the tendrils. "I won't lose you again." The entity let out another deafening roar, its mouths twisting into grotesque grins. "You are weak, Elliot. Fear has always ruled you. Let her go, or you will both fall." Elliot ignored the entity, his focus solely on Eleanor. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the truth. The glow in her chest was fading rapidly, and the darkness was consuming her from within. If he didn't act, they would both be lost. Tears blurred his vision as he made his choice. "I'm not leaving you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not this time." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket, the same one he had found earlier. Its surface glimmered faintly, and as he held it up, it began to glow brighter, pulsing with a warm, golden light. The entity recoiled, its many eyes narrowing in anger. Elliot pressed the locket to Eleanor's chest, and the light erupted in a blinding flash. The tendrils released her, writhing in agony as the glow intensified. Eleanor's body convulsed, the darkness inside her fighting against the light. But slowly, the glow began to spread, pushing back the shadows and restoring her color. The entity let out a final, enraged roar as the light consumed it, its massive form collapsing into the abyss. The ground trembled violently, and the chasm began to close. Elliot pulled Eleanor into his arms, shielding her as the forest around them dissolved into light. When the tremors ceased, they were back at the edge of the forest, the sky above them clear and filled with stars. Eleanor clung to Elliot, her body trembling but whole. "It's over," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with relief. But as they looked back at the forest, a faint tendril of fog curled at its edge, and a single whisper carried on the wind. "For now." The forest loomed behind them, its darkened edge unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. Elliot tightened his grip on Eleanor's hand, his heart still pounding from the confrontation with the entity. The air was cool and crisp, but the feeling of dread lingered, an invisible weight pressing on his chest. Despite the clear sky above and the stars twinkling like distant beacons, something about the atmosphere felt wrong, unnatural. The forest, now devoid of the suffocating fog, seemed too quiet, too lifeless, as though its very soul had been drained. Eleanor walked beside him, her steps unsteady, her face pale. The glow in her chest, which had saved her moments ago, had vanished entirely, leaving only faint traces of light in her eyes. Elliot glanced at her frequently, searching for any signs that the darkness might still linger within her. Her silence was unsettling. She hadn't spoken since they left the forest, and her gaze was distant, unfocused, as though her thoughts were trapped somewhere he couldn't follow. "Eleanor," Elliot said softly, breaking the silence. "Are you okay? Are you still you?" She stopped walking, her body trembling. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression a mix of fear and sorrow. "I think so," she whispered, her voice fragile. "But I can still feel it, like it's watching me, waiting." Elliot's stomach churned. He opened his mouth to reassure her, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel it too, that lingering presence, faint but undeniable. The entity might have been banished, but it wasn't gone. Not entirely. The forest seemed to pulse faintly in the distance, its twisted branches silhouetted against the night sky, as if it were alive, watching them with unseen eyes. As they continued walking, the terrain beneath their feet began to change. The soft forest floor gave way to dry, cracked earth, and the faint metallic smell that had clung to the air intensified. Elliot stopped abruptly, his flashlight sweeping over the ground. His blood ran cold. The footprints. 2 sets of tracks led away from the forest, his own and Eleanor's, but now a third set of prints trailed behind them. They were large, misshapen, and spaced unnaturally far apart, as though whatever had made them was impossibly tall. The tracks seemed to shimmer faintly, as if imbued with some otherworldly energy. They hadn't been there moments ago. "Eleanor," Elliot said, his voice low. "Don't look back." But it was too late. She turned, and her face went pale. The forest edge, which had seemed still and lifeless, now pulsed with faint tendrils of mist, writhing like the limbs of some unseen beast. The third set of footprints led directly back to the forest, disappearing into the shadows as if they had been absorbed. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elliot didn't answer. His mind raced, replaying the entity's final words. It's never over. Had he truly defeated it, or had he only delayed its return? The fog had receded, but the forest still carried its mark, a dark, festering wound on the landscape. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse, as though the entity was holding its breath, biding its time. They resumed their walk, the tension between them heavy. Eleanor clung to his arm now, her small frame trembling. "Elliot," she said after a long silence, her voice barely audible. "Do you think it's really gone?" Elliot hesitated. He wanted to tell her yes, to offer her some semblance of comfort, but the truth weighed heavily on his heart. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll face it together." Eleanor nodded, but her expression didn't change. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but also something deeper. Something darker. As they reached the edge of a small clearing, she stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Elliot," she said, her voice shaking. "Look." He followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. In the middle of the clearing stood a tree, a massive, gnarled oak with twisted branches that reached toward the heavens like claws. Hanging from its lowest branch was something small and glinting faintly in the starlight. It was a silver locket, identical to the one he had used to save Eleanor. "That's not possible," Elliot whispered, stepping forward. His flashlight beam illuminated the locket, its surface polished and pristine, as though it had been placed there moments ago. He reached out hesitantly, but as his fingers brushed the metal, a cold shock ran through his body. The whispers returned. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. A soft, insistent chorus that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath them. Eleanor gasped, clutching at her chest as the faint traces of light in her eyes flickered. "Elliot," she said, her voice panicked. "It's coming back. I can feel it." The ground beneath them began to tremble, and a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air. The shadows around the clearing thickened, coiling like serpents, and the locket grew warm in Elliot's hand. He dropped it instinctively, but the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. Elliot grabbed Eleanor's hand, pulling her away from the clearing. "We need to go. Now." As they ran, the shadows seemed to follow, twisting and writhing just beyond the edges of the light. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, a single word repeating over and over, "Return." They burst through the final stretch of forest, the open road ahead offering a brief glimmer of hope. But as they stepped onto the asphalt, a chilling realization washed over Elliot. The stars above, once bright and clear, were gone, replaced by an inky void. The air was no longer crisp but heavy and damp, and the faint smell of the fog returned. Eleanor's grip on his hand tightened. "Elliot," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't leave." He turned slowly, his heart sinking. Behind them, the forest loomed once more, its edge pulsing with faint light. The road, the clearing, even the locket, all of it was gone, swallowed by the fog that now crept toward them with deliberate intent. The entity's laughter echoed faintly on the wind, and Elliot realized the truth. They had never escaped. The fog had let them go only to pull them back in, and this time there would be no way out.